on the menu tonight, Rene Girard, indeed, French thinker. And the title of my talk tonight will be Digital Dual. So we're going to take a look at how archaic humans are doing in the current world. And this is a world that is networked. And so we're going to take a look how archaic humans are doing in the networked apocalypse. So that's on the menu tonight. And let's start with some keywords of things that will pass tonight. Desire, sex, greed, madness, violence, plague, sacrifice, death, and God. That's on the menu tonight, so I hope that at least some of these topics are of some interest to you. Okay, so this is a picture that I got from Facebook. So this shows the Facebook connections visualized on a map of the world. And you can see that the whole world, just judging by Facebook connection, is highly networked, is highly interconnected. And that is very new. That has never been like this in the history of mankind. Now, let's take a look at so that's, of course, the modern world. That's modern technology. And let's take a look at ancient humanity. So Homo sapiens is about 300,000 years old. And you see a fossil from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco to the right, which is the fossil of the first Homo sapiens. Behavioral modernity, which means fire, trade, symbols, music, and stuff like that. That's about 50,000 years old. History starts traditionally with Herodotus. That's about 2,500 years old. And now fast forward, the internet with TCP/IP, HTML, internet service providers, that's about 30 years old. Very, very new. And at the moment, there are about 4.5 billion people connected via the internet. And by 2023, we expect about 43 billion devices to be connected to the internet. That means that your fridge, your front door, and stuff like that, everything will be connected to the internet. So we live in a hyper-connected world. And I think it's very interesting to see what such a hyper-connected world does when it becomes, when an archaic humans are confronted with such a world. So a lot of people have been trying to figure out how humans actually work. And here you see three of the most famous ones. So to the left, you see Sigmund Freud. To the right, you see Jung. And in the middle, maybe a bit less known, but very influential, you see Jacques Lacan with his characteristic way of dressing. But none of these guys are going to feature prominently tonight. We're going to take a look at another thinker who's been thinking very hard about how humans actually function, and that is Rene Girard. So he was born in 1923 in France, and he died in 2015. He was a historian, a literary critic, a philosophical anthropologist, and his first book appeared in 1961. It was called Desire, Deceit, and the Novel. And he's written about 22 books, and I've read most of them. So a couple of books are pretty obscure, and I haven't gotten hold of them yet, but I will. He was born in Avignon in France, and he had a career in the US. So he had positions at Johns Hopkins and at Stanford, and he was also a member of the Académie Française. So this is not an obscure New Age thinker. This is actually a very an academically a thinker that was embedded in some very important universities, and that was also celebrated in an academic setting. So before we start to look at Girard, we first have to look at something more. Let's say we have to kind of set the scene, and we have to take a look at our bedrock of primary emotions. In other words, we have to take a look at what the drive system is of human beings. And for that, we briefly have to spend some time with another thinker, and that thinker is called Jacques Panksepp. He was a neuroscientist. He died in 2017, and he founded the field of affective neuroscience. So in other words, he studied the human emotionalist system and the emotional system of mammals. So you see him to the right. So he's wearing a mouse mask, and that's because he was doing a lot of experiments on well, it's a rat mask actually. He was doing a lot of experiments on rats because rats are actually an excellent model system to study humans. It's depressing, but it's like that. And it turns out that humans, rats, and in fact all mammals, they have 7 primary emotions. And these 7 primary emotions are care, play, and lust. So these are pleasant ones. You wanna care, that's friendship, play, lust, sexuality, that's fun. And then there's fear, grief and panic, and rage. And these are very unpleasant emotions. These are emotions that we try to avoid. And then there's another emotion, another primary emotion, that's called seeking, and that's basically your drive, your curiosity. So the urge to seek out novelty. So these are our 7 primary emotions, and you can think of these as our primary drive. So these are kind of the very basic emotions that stimulate us and that drive us forward. This is very old stuff, so you can also find these emotional systems, so that he mapped them very precisely to the brain. So they're in the oldest part of our brain, in the brainstem, in the so-called reptile brain. And in fact, all vertebrates share this emotional system more or less. So this is very old, 600 to 400 million years old. So, but now there's a question. So there's desire and there's drive. So drive is sexuality, there's lust. But lust, sexuality doesn't explain what we find attractive. So here you see 2 pictures. To the left, you see a painting by Rubens from the 17th century, depicting the female ideal of that time. And to the right, you see Twiggy, a very famous model from the 60s. Now, this has something to do with sexuality, but you can see that the Venus of Rubens is very different from the model from the 60s. So the question is, why does sexuality project itself sometimes on this type that Rubens presents, and why is it sometimes projected on a very different type? So that's the difference between desire and drive. And when it comes to desire, this is where Girard will provide us with some answers. So why do we want what we want? Why do we prefer Twiggy, or why do we prefer the 17th century woman that Rubens painted? And this is something to do with something called mimetic desire. And that's basically one of Girard's great ideas, and I will try to explain it in the coming 10 minutes or so. So here are some of the books that, if you're interested in Girard, some of the books that you can take a look at. So the one to the left, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, appeared in 1978, and that's his big magnum opus, so very detailed, and it gives an overview of a lot of his theories. The book in the middle, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, is a short book and a very good introduction to his thinking. And a lot of the ideas that I will talk about today, they come from the book to the right, Battling to the End, which appeared in 2007. So that's it. Now let's jump straight into the action. And let's take a look at mimetic desire. So what is mimetic desire? So the big idea of Girard is that desire is triangular. So you want something because somebody else wants it as well. So there's always a subject. So can you see my pointer actually? Yeah, you can see it. Okay. So there's always a subject. There's always a mediator or a model, and there's an object. So mimetic desire basically means that you will want an object that is wanted by a model or a mediator. So desire is always triangular. So there's a subject, a model or mediator, and then an object. So, and this desire that the mediator or the model has for the object, this is either genuine, but it could also be a purely imaginary desire. And this is why advertisement works. So here to the right, you see Mr. George Clooney, and you see his Omega watch. So we see these types of advertisements. We say, oh, George Clooney wants this watch. And as a result, we also want this watch. Now, it's a bit unclear whether George Clooney really wants this watch or whether he just got paid to want this watch in the advertisement, but it doesn't matter. Advertisement actually works. We see somebody like George Clooney wanting somebody, and as a result, we also want it. Now, it's very important to understand that this is not just a tendency that we have. Everything you want, all your desires, they they are mediated by a model. So you always want what somebody else wants. So we are basically present in one big network of desire where we constantly pick up desires that come from other people. Individual desire, according to Girard, is an illusion. Desire is always picked up from a model. And in fact, this celebration of individual desire, that there is this deep desire in yourself that you need to find and that is your own, this is a 19th century delusion, and it comes from 19th century Romanticism. So in this belief that desire is our own, that desire is deeply embedded in ourselves and that we have a very personal desire, this is what Girard called méconnaissance, misrecognition. It's a misunderstanding of the nature of desire. Let's take a look at some examples. How can we understand some of the things that are going on with respect to desire using Girard's framework? So let's start with the Oedipus complex. So here's a bit of Freud at the top. From The Ego and the It from 1923, the sexual wishes in regard to the mother become more intense and the father is perceived as an obstacle to them. This gives rise to the Oedipus complex. You want to have sex with your mother and you want to kill your father. So that's basically the Oedipus complex. And Freud says that this is a very fundamental thing in a human being. And this triangle is then transplanted to the rest of your life. Not so, says Girard. There's nothing special about the Oedipus complex. This is just a simple example of triangular desire. So Girard writes in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World in 1978, the Oedipus complex is something Freud invented to explain triangular rivalries. Another thing that is very interesting to take a look at from a Girardian point of view is masochism. Girard calls this pseudo-masochism, and I'll explain immediately why there is a pseudo in front of it. As we all know, possession of an object, let's say the trophy wife, the perfect job, the perfect house, and so on, it never results in permanent satisfaction. It never results in perfect being. After some time, we always get disappointed with what we have. Now, masochists and sadists, they have understood that very, very well. So what's going on in a sadomasochistic relationship? Well, the masochist looks for a powerful model that prevents reaching a virtual object of desire. Why is that? Well, that's not in order to experience pain. It might look like that, but that's not the core thing here. But it's in order to avoid disappointment. You actually want to be close to an object desire, but you don't want to get it because getting it means disappointment. So that's what the masochist gets out of it, and the pseudo means that it looks like pain is at center stage here, but that's not the core. The core event that's going on here. What's really going on here is the avoiding disappointment. Now, the sadist, what does the sadist get out of it? Well, the sadist pretends to enjoy perfect being because the sadist possesses the virtual object of desire. So the masochist and the sadist, they keep each other in equilibrium. So the sadist basically pretends that he has this virtual object that means perfect being, and the masochist wants to be close to that object that implies perfect being. And this basically this exercise that the masochist and the sadist are doing. So these images that they project to each other. So that has something to do with Lacan, with what Jacques Lacan, another psychoanalyst, calls the imaginary, as far as I understand, as far as anybody understands Lacan. Another thing that is interesting is pseudo-narcissism. So pseudo-narcissism, what is that about? So let me just read what Girard writes. So the coquette knows very well that desire attracts desire. So in order to be desired, one must convince others that one desires oneself. So if you can make others believe that you desire yourself and that you don't need anybody else, you will become very attractive. Why? Again, because you have the triangle, and because in this case, the model and the object become one. So if the narcissistic woman excites desire, this is because when she pretends to desire herself, and it suggests to Freud a kind of circular desire that never gets outside itself, she offers an irresistible temptation to the mimetic desire of others. So in other words, it's a shtick to make yourself very desirable. You just desire yourself. And this is called coquetry. Now, if I have given you the impression that this is limited to women, let me get you immediately out of that illusion. So another thing that is pseudo-narcissism is basically the good old guru shtick, right? So you pretend that you have some kind of happiness that other people do not have, and then you let yourself be paid to teach people in order to reach that kind of happiness. And this is, again, pseudo-narcissism. So you project this perfect self-love to other people, and that makes you very, very desirable. So there's a very interesting documentary called Kumare, where an actor pretends to be an Eastern guru, and he gets away with it very, very well. And so if you want to see pseudo-narcissism as applied to a guru and his disciples, then I advise you to take a look at this documentary. So why is it called pseudo-narcissism? Well, it's of course because the self-love isn't really there. Nobody loves themselves all the time. So it is kind of a thing that you project to others. It's a game. It's an image that you project, and hence pseudo-narcissism and not just narcissism. Okay. So we have mimetic desire. So there's a subject, there's a model, and there's an object of desire. So, but this type of desire can also become a bit more serious, and it can become metaphysical desire. So Girard says that all desire, essentially, in the end, is a desire for being. You want to be you want to have a certain perfect way of being. So we desire the being that others seem to have. So when you buy the watch, you're not so much buying the watch, but you're buying the being of George Clooney. You buy that watch because you want to be like George Clooney. So desire has a tendency to shift from objects, that is the watch, to being, and that is Mr. George Clooney. And the more your desire shifts towards metaphysical desire, so desire for the being of somebody else, the more miserable you will be. Now, let's bring in some modern technology now. So this here is a picture from The Economist from 2021. And on this slide, you see the arrows that represent the influence of Instagram and YouTube in various countries. So, so the colored arrows represent the percentage of connections that go from one country to another. So you can see that the great majority of important connections go from the United States to other countries. So from the United States to Britain, Spain, Russia, Mexico, India, Germany, France, and Brazil. So everything goes from the States to other countries. And there are only a couple of other connections, like there's a connection between Spain and Mexico, and there's a connection which makes sense. And then there's a connection, kind of a mysterious connection between Brazil and Germany that nobody has ever explained me why it's there, but it's there for some reason. But the important thing to note here is that it's clear that the world, that when we look at social networks, it's clear that to the world, America still represents a model to the world. So if you look at these connections in social networks, it's very clear that America represents a model, and the countries that are connected to the United States, so they represent subjects. All right. Let's see how am I doing with time. Okay, not so bad. So that was about desire. Desire is triangular. We have metaphysical desire. Desire is closely linked to violence. It's closely linked to rivalry. It's closely linked to crisis. So let's take a look at how that plays out. So I explained to you before that that desire is triangular. So we have the subject, we have the mediator or the model, and we have the object. But you can see here that there's also an important factor, and that is the distance between the subject and the mediator. So the distance between you and George Clooney is conceivably quite big. I mean, you probably don't meet George Clooney on a regular basis, so there the distance would be very high. However, if the distance is very close, then you easily end up in rivalry, thanks to mimesis. So, and the Bible has a very nice story that illustrates this, the story of Cain and Abel. So I guess we all know it, or maybe it's worth repeating. So Cain and Abel are doing a sacrifice to God because they, of course, want to get the blessing of God. Abel's sacrifice is accepted and Cain's sacrifice is rejected by God. So they go into competition about being blessed by God, right? So there's a subject and a mediator. So Cain and Abel are subject and mediator to each other. There's an object, which is the blessing of God. And the distance between subject and mediator, between Cain and Abel, is very small. So they get angry at each other. And the next thing that happens is that Cain slays Abel. So Cain kills Abel. And this is very common. So you pick up the desire from somebody else, and typically it's somebody that you respect or that you admire. And because you start competing about the same object, you actually end up in rivalry and you end up in conflict. So desire inherently leads to rivalry and inherently leads to conflict. And I want to illustrate this with somebody that I'm very fond of and that I've also spent a lot of time on studying, and that is Nietzsche. So Nietzsche has this very famous concept, and that is called the will to power. Now, from a Girardian point of view, what is the will to power? The will to power is nothing else than you are competing with the model. So the subject is competing with the model or the mediator over an object. Now, and if you feel that you are going to win over the mediator and you are going to obtain the object is going to be yours and the mediator is going to lose, this will cause a feeling into the subject that Nietzsche has called the will to power. So this is, of course, not Nietzsche's interpretation of the will to power, but it's Girard's interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power. So will to power is, yes, I'm going to win over the model and I'm going to get the object. Now, what happens if you are losing the object and if the mediator actually gets the object, gets the house, the job, the wife, and so on? What you will then experience is ressentiment. You will feel resentment with respect to the model or the mediator because the model has acquired the object that you both want. So this is a very interesting interpretation of a very fundamental notion in Nietzsche's philosophy, and it of course makes it very interesting to read Nietzsche from this point of view. So if we look at Nietzsche's life, Nietzsche was actually very prone to mimetic desire, and his big rival, his big model was Richard Wagner, so the opera composer, right? And Nietzsche was actually so he was competing with Wagner in the areas that Wagner was doing really well. So he wanted to compete with Wagner in writing music. So Nietzsche actually wrote music. And if you go to Spotify, you can listen to Nietzsche's compositions. Yes, Nietzsche was a composer. Of course, Wagner was laughing at Nietzsche's music, and Nietzsche became very sad at that. So again, Wagner is the model. Wagner has the object of desire. Wagner makes great music, and Nietzsche loses out. Resentment. There's more than that. There was also the wife of Wagner, Cosima Wagner. So Nietzsche was very much in love with Cosima Wagner, actually tried to make her leave Wagner. That also didn't work out. So again, Wagner as a model wins the object and Nietzsche loses out. So again, Nietzsche plunges into ressentiment. And how did it go with Nietzsche? Well, here you can see how dangerous desire is. So Nietzsche oscillated between will to power and ressentiment. Will to power when he feels that he was on top of things, ressentiment when he felt that the model was overpowering him. So you go into this oscillation where you experience will to power and you experience resentment. So Wagner became a model obstacle. So somebody to admire, but also somebody to hate, and somebody who presents an obstacle. That leads to bipolarity. So you go in mania and depression. And those oscillations, the oscillation between mania and depression goes faster and faster. So you get into something that is called a seesaw. That ultimately leads to psychosis. And that's also what happened to Nietzsche. That's at least what Girard makes of it. He had an ultimate breakdown in Turin in 1889. He wrote some final letters, the delusion notes, the Wahnzettel, where he identified himself with Jesus and Dionysus, and he dies more than 10 years later in 1900. So this illustrates how dangerous it is to completely give in to desire without setting limits. Okay, so let's now take a look at Buddhism, the wheel of samsara. So again, desire, but this time not from a Nietzschean point of view, but from a Buddhist point of view. So this is the wheel of samsara in Buddhism. And so you see there a bird, a snake, and a pig, and they're biting each other's tails. So the bird stands for greed, the snake stands for anger, and the pig stands for ignorance. And this can be easily interpreted from a Girardian point of view. And what is the wheel of samsara? So the wheel of samsara means that, well, existence is very unsatisfying, and it's because we constantly cycle between greed, anger, and ignorance. Let's take a look at that from a Girardian point of view. What's greed? Greed is nothing else than Nietzsche's will to power, Nietzsche's master morality, the libido of Freud, the jouissance of Lacan. It's nothing else than Girard's metaphysical desire. So it's a strong desire to have perfect being. So that's basically something that you could say that this corresponds to the greed of Buddhism. Anger corresponds to Nietzsche's ressentiment, Nietzsche's slave morality, the castration of Freud and Lacan, the death drive of Freud, the mortido of Alexander Barth, or according to Girard, this is nothing else than rivalry with the model obstacle. And then finally, ignorance. Ignorance of what? Well, that's of course ignorance of the nature of desire. So in Buddhism, this is called sem, or ordinary mind. It's the romantic idea of individual desire. It's the belief in full jouissance, in full satisfaction. And this is what Girard has called méconnaissance. It's not understanding the nature of desire. So this is basically a very quick look at Buddhism from a Girardian viewpoint. Next topic, religious prohibition. So religions, one of the characteristics of religions is that they have prohibitions. And why do they have prohibitions? Well, they have prohibitions because they want to avoid undifferentiation. Let's take a look at that. Here we're in the 16th century, and the guy in the middle here with the dramatic pose, that's Martin Luther. And Martin Luther at that point is a good Catholic, and he just has some things that he is a bit unhappy with, things that are going on in the Catholic Church. So he basically complains a bit, and he's called to Charles V in 1521, and he's standing there and he says, well, these are my objections. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. So this is kind of like a simple disagreement among people that are all believe in Jesus Christ. They're all Christians. So far, so good. Fast forward to 1572, you have the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, where about 30,000 Protestants were killed. And then in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, which was going on all over Europe, which was one of the most bloody wars in the history of mankind, with up to 60% mortality in certain regions and a total death toll of between 4 and 12 million people. Now, all of these people that were fighting each other, they believed in Jesus Christ. They believed, they took the Bible as the word of God, and nonetheless, they killed each other. And they killed each other with great enthusiasm. And this is another insight that Girard points out. So you will get into conflict with people that are similar to you, not with people that are different from you. The people that are different from you, they want different things. So you will not compete with them. The people that you compete with, even though they look very different, they are very similar because they're competing with you about the same objects. And this is basically what happened here in the 17th century. So it's very, very important that societies do not become undifferentiated, where everybody becomes very, very similar. Because if you have societies where people become very, very similar, people start competing with each other, competition gets out of hand, and you get something that is called mimetic crisis. And that is war of all against all. And that happened here in the 17th century. So religion is very concerned with avoiding this, with avoiding undifferentiation and avoiding mimetic crisis. And this is basically the answer to this very puzzling question: why is religion always regulating sexuality? Illustrated here to the left by a picture of Félicien Rops, that shows the temptation of Saint Anthony. So why is religion always regulating your sexuality? Why is religion always looking into the bedroom? Well, it's because sexuality is, of course, a great source of competition. And religion wants to regulate sexuality because it's one way to avoid rivalry getting out of hand. And one thing that makes it very clear that religion is interested in avoiding undifferentiation is in some very peculiar practices around twins. So here you have a newspaper article from 2008. It's about a practice in Madagascar where twins that are born on that island, they were separated from each other at birth. And in many cultures, actually, twins are killed. You kill both twins, or one of the twins is killed. Very, very peculiar, very difficult to understand. Not so difficult for Girard, because he basically points out this is a remnant, or this is something that shows the concern of religion for undifferentiation. Twins, they are a symbol of the undifferentiation. You have two human beings that look exactly alike. Religion abhors that. Religion abhors undifferentiation. So twins are killed or separated at birth. And this is a very universal feature of many cultures. So you can see that mimetic desire explains, so Girard's mimetic theory explains a lot of puzzling things that are going on in religious practices. All right. So mimetic crisis, you have undifferentiation. Everybody's competing with everybody. There's rivalry everywhere. How do you get out of the conflict? That's a big question. So do you sit down around the campfire, sing a couple of songs, and then, talk about it, share your feelings, and everything is solved? Not really. The solution is a lot more bloody and a lot more cynical, and that leads us to the concept of the scapegoat. Plagues, mobs, and scapegoats. So if you have a crisis, just as the crisis in the 17th century with the 30 Years' War. So often such a crisis is simply called a plague. So plague, in the ancient documents, in medieval documents, a plague can both mean a disease, but it could also be war. It could also be conflict in the whole of society. And typically these things happen together. War, plague, conflict. It was one big mess. So typically plague was used for mimetic conflict, for undifferentiation, for escalation. How do you get rid of such a plague? How do you get rid of conflict that pervades the whole of society? Well, it's very simple. You basically agree that it's the fault of a scapegoat. You just pick somebody that you don't like, and everybody agrees nobody likes this person. You blame that person and you kill that person. And that's a way to pacify conflict in societies. And that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. Typically, this is done using stoning, because a whole society can stone a scapegoat without anybody being really guilty, because everybody threw a stone, right? So in the West, the traditional scapegoats are, of course, the Jews. They killed Jesus Christ, so they were often blamed for wars, for famines, for plagues. So blame the Jews, kill the Jews, and then you pacify the entire community. Women are often used as scapegoats. They have a lower position in society, they're weaker physical strength, so revenge is less of a problem. And you can also see this in the fact that there are more goddesses than gods in archaic religion. And I explain the link between scapegoats and deities and goddesses, the link between scapegoats and gods and goddesses immediately. So of course, women as scapegoats, think about the burning of witches in Europe. So this is a good example of women being used as scapegoats. So pagan ritual. So basically, if you have conflict in society, you can just pick a scapegoat, kill the scapegoat, pacify the community. Great. So people quickly figured out that this needs to be done regularly, because conflict in society erupts regularly. So why not just regularly pick somebody and kill that person, that scapegoat, in order to keep our society peaceful? And this is essentially the core of pagan religion. Pagan religion is that every month we're going to drag some poor scapegoats to the slaughter, kill the scapegoats, and that way pacify all the conflict in the community. Again, all the sins, the problems in the community, they are loaded on the scapegoat. So by killing the scapegoat, you get rid of your problems. Now, this is not only done in so-called primitive societies. Ancient Greece, that fantastically very admired, fantastically advanced society, in ancient Greece, you had a pagan ritual that involved organized murder, so regular murder of scapegoats. And that ritual involved something called the pharmakos. So the pharmakos was the slave that was killed as a scapegoat, and that's actually the word. So the pharmakos has given rise to the word pharmacy and pharmakon in our modern language. So the ancient Greek, very civilized, they regularly killed scapegoats in order to pacify their society. The Romans did the same thing. So, and this is the essence of pagan society. Now, something peculiar happens when you kill the scapegoat. So the whole society is in turmoil. You bring in the scapegoat, you slaughter the scapegoat, and lo and behold, all the violence, all the problems, all the conflict in the society is gone. Magic. So this is related to deification of the scapegoat. Before you kill the scapegoat is loaded with all the sins of the society, all the conflict of the society. After you kill the scapegoat, magic happens, the whole society pacifies, and that means that you turn the scapegoat into a god. So the scapegoat, once killed, becomes a deity. And you can see this mechanism in a lot of myths. So I know that a lot of people are very fond in all these psychological interpretations of myths. Freud also did that. But basically, myths are just embellished stories about primordial murder. Most myths are nothing else than the story of we took a scapegoat, we killed the scapegoat, and that way we got rid of all the conflict in our society. And now we're also going to make a nice story about it so we can keep on repeating it in our rituals, sustained by pagan myths. So they're basically embellished stories about primordial murders. So here's an example, Zeus and Dionysus. So when Zeus made Persephone pregnant, his wife Hera fell into a jealous rage. She sent the Titans to tear the infant Dionysus apart. They then consumed all of the corpse except the heart. And then Zeus did the only thing that was logically possible. So the heart was saved, and it was sewn into Zeus's thigh, where he was gestated and born anew. So this looks like a very nice story. You can interpret it in some kind of psychological way, but at the heart of it, it's basically just a story of a murder, and then a lot of kind of embellishments, a lot of typical mythical elements added. But myth is murder, not meat, but myth. Good. So let's see how I'm doing with time. Yeah. So what's the difference between myth and gospel? Big difference. So also Jesus Christ, scapegoated, killed, resurrected. These are all the elements that you find in many, many, many myths. So is Christianity just another myth? Not really. There's a big difference. So instead of blaming victimization on the victims, because that's what myth does, so the victim that is killed in myths is always seen as guilty, the Gospels blame it on the victimizers. So Jesus Christ was actually an innocent scapegoat, and it's very clear that he was innocent. In the myth, a scapegoat is always guilty. So what the myths systematically hide, the Bible reveals. So the Bible is somewhat of an inverse myth, revealing this very archaic ritual, or this very, very archaic mechanism to pacify communities. So, according to Girard, then, what is a Christian? Well, to become Christian is fundamentally to perceive that it isn't just others who have scapegoats. And to imitate Christ by keeping the other at the right distance is to escape the mimetic whirlpool. No longer imitate in order to no longer be imitated. So that's, according to Girard, the core of Christianity, or one of the cores of Christianity. It's basically understanding that scapegoating is a human affair. We all do it instinctively. And basically, according to Girard, to become Christian is to become aware of the scapegoating that you do yourself. One final thing about Christianity. So Satan and the Holy Spirit. Well, what's that about? Well, Satan is nothing else than the accuser, the adversary. It's the mob that accuses the scapegoat. And the Paraclete, or the Holy Spirit, is the advocate for the scapegoat, the spirit of truth, because the scapegoat is never as guilty as the mob thinks it is. So Satan and Holy Spirit, they basically are about the bloodthirst of the mob versus the defense of the victim, versus the truth that says like, well, this scapegoat is not as guilty as the mob says it is. Yeah, I'm gonna skip this. So now let's take a look at some religious paradigms. Now that we had a lot of knowledge about desire, let's take a look at different ways of doing religion. So I already talked about paganism and Christianity, which is kind of an inverse paganism. It's a rejection of paganism. And now we bring in some more Buddhism, and we bring in Sutra and Tantra. So what's paganism? Already pointed it out. So paganism is regularly, we're going to form a mob, we're going to kill the scapegoats, and that way we're going to specify our society. So this has been going on since the dawn of mankind. So here you see a picture from an Aztec burial in Mexico City. So which was very much, that kind of society was very much based on sacrifice. So this is a very typical pagan society. Pagan societies are built on regular pacification of the society through scapegoating and through slaughtering of the scapegoat. The guy to the right, Adolf Hitler, so he basically tried to bring back paganism to the West. And Nazi Germany can be seen as a resurgence of paganism in the West. Now, Buddhism comes in different types. So there's Sutric Buddhism and there's Tantric Buddhism. So there's also Dzogchen, which I will not talk about today. So what is Sutra? Sutra is basically renunciation of desire. So Buddhism has understood, just like Christianity, that desire is very, very dangerous. And in Sutric Buddhism, you're going to renunciate your desire. So here you see a monk that is meditating on a putrefying corpse. This is actually done in various traditions in Asia. And this is, of course, to reject desire that is associated with the body. So Sutric Buddhism rejects desire and tries to limit desire in order not to get into these escalations, not to get into metaphysical desire, into scapegoating, into crisis, and so on and so on. It's a giving up of desire. Now, Christianity is very close to Sutra in many respects. So here you see the 10 commandments, and I just want to emphasize the last one. So thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, that is desire the wife of somebody else, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet, that is, thou shalt not want what other people have. So all of these commandments, they are very clearly Sutric commandments that try to limit the reach of mimetic desire. So Christianity can, to a certain extent, be considered as an attempt to limit desire, just like Sutric Buddhism does. There's also Tantric Buddhism. So what's Tantric Buddhism about? So this is often interpreted, oh, Tantric Buddhism, Tantra is about sexuality and this and that. Well, sexuality definitely plays a role because sexuality has something to do with desire, but that's not the real key issue here. Tantra is about the transformation of desire. Here's a quote from Rene Girard from Battling to the End, one of his last books. I long tried to think of Christianity as in a higher position, but I have had to give up on that. I am now persuaded that we have to think from inside mimetism. Basically thinking inside of very strong desire. So when it's too late, when the sutric mechanism hasn't worked and when you're actually overwhelmed by desire. So what do you do then? So here's another quote from Lama Thupten Nyeshe, a very famous tantric Buddhist teacher, one of the first who brought tantric Buddhism to the West. The basic energy involved in this profound process of tantric transformation is the energy of our own desires. So you're going to work within desire. So basically tantric Buddhism, so Buddhism works with sutra, where you have a limitation of desire, renunciation. But then in these moments or situations where desire is actually overwhelming or where you can make use of desire, Tantra is concerned with the transformation of desire, with kind of working with desire while avoiding the dangerous aspects of desire. So here to the right, you see Tantepa, the gambler, one of the 84 Mahasiddhas. So these are great tantric saints, so to say. And so Tantepa was a very hardcore gambler who lost everything in his life due to gambling. And then he met a great tantric sage, a yogin, and that sage asked him, since nothing else in your life is paying off, why not try some meditation? And Tantepa answered, if you've got a meditation that I could practice without having to give up gambling, I might just try it. So he gambled and he meditated and he became one of the 84 Mahasiddhas. And this is kind of a story that illustrates the core of Tantra. That's the core idea of Tantra. It's working with desire from within desire and transform desire into something that you could call, let's say, something that is constructive. Nietzsche had a lot of tantric ideas. You can kind of think of Nietzsche as a tantric Buddhist. Unfortunately, somebody without a sangha, so he was all alone. So it kind of ended a bit badly with him. But he had very, very, very good insights. And one of the great texts that he wrote, this comes from also Sprach Zarathustra. I will read it to you. Once you had passions and called them evil, but now you have only your virtues. They grew out of your passions. You set your highest goal in the heart of those passions, then they became your virtues and joys. And though you were full of the race of the hot-tempered, and though you were of the race of the hot-tempered, or of the lustful, or of the fanatical, or the vengeful, in the end, all your passions became virtues, and all your devils angels. Once you had wild dogs in your cellar, but they changed at last into birds and charming singers. Again, the core idea of Tantra, and you find it in Nietzsche. Amazing. Okay, let's end this. Let's take a look at the mimesis in the global empire. That is in the hyper-connected world that we live in today. Let's take a look at the digital apocalypse. Another quote from Girard from an interview with that he gave in 2009. A mimetic crisis is when people become undifferentiated. There are no more social classes, there are no more social differences, and so forth. When differences are suppressed, conflicts become rationally insoluble. They are solved by what we call a scapegoat process. So if everybody becomes the same, if everybody becomes undifferentiated and hyper-connected, you will get hyper-connectivity, you will also get hypermimesis. You will get desire, hyper-desire, you will get hyper-competition, and you will get rampant competition. And this is basically the world that we live in today. So this is from his last book, Battling to the End, 2007. So this is a book about Karl von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian general who lived from 1780 to 1831, and he noticed an escalation already in the 19th century. He noticed that war was getting more and more violent, and that more and more rules that were traditionally associated with war were broken. War is an act of violence which in its application knows no bounds. As one dictates the law to the other, there arises a sort of reciprocal action, which in the conception must lead to an extreme. In other words, violence can escalate and it can lead to extreme. And in a hyper-connected world that we live in right now, a world that has nuclear weapons, such an escalation is extremely dangerous. And that's basically what Girard's last book was about. Not only was Clausewitz right, he wrote, in opposition to Hegel and our modern wisdom, but what he was right about has terrible implications for humanity. This warmonger alone saw certain things. So von Clausewitz, smarter than Hegel. Many people do not like this. So we live in apocalyptic times. What does that mean? We live in a world of hyperconnectivity and undifferentiation. Differences are being erased at a breathtaking speed. Religious prohibitions that try to keep people differentiated and at the right distance are breaking down. This is essentially the famous meaning crisis. It's just the lack of religious prohibitions. This leads to hypermimesis, mimetic crisis. Normally, or let's say in old societies, you could do scapegoating in order to get out of the crisis, but scapegoating is not possible anymore. You can't really burn people on the corner of a street in order to pacify the conflict in your society. So scapegoating stopped working. It's ineffective. Christianity made sure of that. So we run the risk of escalating to extremes of war, and especially with nuclear weapons, of course. That's the end game. Game over. However, apocalypse doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world. It actually means revelation. It means a new situation has come to light, and it also gives you some opportunities. So the apocalypse does not announce the end of the world. It creates hope. There's a new situation. New things have been revealed. And of course, it's up to us to react to them. So I'll stop with this quote by René Girard that gives you something to ponder about. And he writes, "We didn't stop burning witches because we invented science. We invented science because we stopped burning witches." Thank you.